Welcome to the Writer's Journey podcast. I'm Michael Laran, a science fiction and fantasy author on a journey to go from nobody to bestseller, and I'm documenting every step of the way. Tune in every week as I pull back the curtain on my writing life and how I'm building a writing career while working a full-time job, raising a family, and attending law school classes in the evenings. You can find show notes for this week's episode, a free starter library of my fiction, and much more at michaellaran.com. Hello and welcome to episode 82. 82 is a fantastic number, and this week I have a couple of things that I wanted to talk about this week. First off, I had a much better week so far this week compared to last week. The title of my last week's episode, I think, was Good Luck, Bad Luck, which was really just bad luck. I just had all sorts of crazy things that were happening with me, with personal life, with my daughter, with my puppy, and so on and so forth. And things are much better and much calmer this week, which is a much needed breather. So I talked last week about how October is just the worst month for me from a fall semester perspective. And I've been trying to do some things to, quote, take the teeth out of October. All right. How do I take the teeth out of October so that I can have a much better month so that I'm not going crazy at the end of the month, right? Because right around the middle of the month, things get nuts. So October is that semester where the work starts ramping up at work because, you know, most places have an end of the year rush, and that usually begins in October. There's usually lots more phone calls, lots more emails, all those sorts of things. And then in class at law school, right? I mean, you're at smack dab in the middle of semester. It's usually when you have the biggest reading assignments. It's when you start really seriously thinking about the final and what you have to do to prepare for that. And then the weather starts changing. It just gets crazy, right? And so I've got some travel coming up later in the month for business. And so that's always pretty disruptive too. So one of the things that I've been doing throughout the semester to take the teeth out of October is doing extra reading. So every single day from about 2 weeks prior to the beginning of the semester, I've been reading my book. And so I finished a 700-page book in less than a month. And so now I found that just by doing that extra 30 to 45 minutes a day of reading, now I have like an hour back in my day because I don't need to spend as much time prepping for the class. And I still have to spend a lot of time doing it, but I don't have to spend as much time. And so I'm finding, wow, I kind of have some extra time. This is weird. So what am I going to do with this time? So I'm still trying to figure that out. I still have some non-writing things that I have to finish this year, but I may slowly start to phase some things back in that I was doing before. So that's really exciting. And man, it makes a huge difference when you finish your book early in the semester, like just how dramatically things drop off. Like I knew that I would get some time back, but I didn't realize how dramatic it would be and how fast it would be. So that's a huge benefit for me. And so now I'm doing some review, and I'm to the point where I can start memorizing the cases that I'm studying and so on and so forth. But that's enough about school. I went to a artificial intelligence webinar yesterday, and it was pretty cool. It was put on by a artificial intelligence vendor or a company that kind of specializes in it. And this particular company, they happen to identify an issue of, you know, there are a lot of artificial intelligence demands out there in the world, but there aren't enough data scientists. And so this particular company, they built a artificial intelligence, I guess you could call it like a dashboard. And what it does is it allows you to create your own models or apply kind of their own models to your data, which I thought was kind of interesting. It has more applications to like larger companies, but there definitely is a smaller company application, right? Because, you know, if you're a small company, you can't afford to hire a data scientist to analyze your data, right? And so some of the takeaways from that were mostly related to industry and mostly related to business. But I thought, you know, that could be something that comes down the pike is artificial intelligence services where you can rent a data scientist or you can hire a data scientist to look at certain samples of data. right? And so then I started thinking, okay, this is related to like insurance, but what does artificial intelligence look like in the publishing community? Like if I went to do a Google search for artificial intelligence for traditional publishers, what happens? And there are a few players in the space. I did a little bit of research, and it's still not as prevalent as I guess you would think that it would be. But it looks like traditional publishers are starting to use AI to analyze their backlist, right? They're using it to analyze manuscripts that come in to see if that book has sales potential, right? And so then you have to ask the question, well, what parameters are publishers using to gauge whether a book has sales material? And so some of the vendors, they use sales data and prior sales data, but that's not always an accurate indicator of performance, right? If someone games the system, or if there's luck, then just because a book sells really well doesn't mean that another book just like it is going to sell very well, right? And so then there are other vendors that are trying to make their models blind to the publishing data, so like not looking at sales at all, and instead doing text analysis to analyze the actual text to see what the commonalities are between a number of books in a portfolio. And so I think that's interesting. I don't know that the text analysis is there yet. Like, I don't know that AI is to a point where it can read a book and say, okay, your book is similar to Stephen King's, I don't know, It, or your book is similar to some obscure self-published novel that was published in 2017, Like, I don't think that AI is at a point where it can do that yet. So I don't really know that a lot of the AI stuff that publishers are doing has a whole lot of legs. I do think that they probably are benefiting if they're using it and using AI to streamline some of their operations. So just in terms of their operating model and how they operate, I think there's probably some use there. There's probably some use with logistics and so on and so forth. But my point of going into all of this, because you're probably like, where are you going with this, Michael? My point is that it's probably not a bad thing that publishers are not too deep into AI yet. It's on their radar, and I know that there are publishers that are using it. I think the point to start paying attention is when publishers start parading it out, right? So when they start saying, we have an AI algorithm or a contract with an AI company that allows us to read the text of a book and predict with 50% or 40% certainty that this book will achieve X level of sales. When you start hearing conversations like that, that's when I think you need to start paying attention. And I think the issue that we're going to have to deal with as writers is, how do we compete against that, right? Because the technology is not there at this time. But what if in 10 to 15 years from now, that is the selling proposition of a traditional publisher, right? That, yeah, you can self-publish your book if you want. I mean, that's great. But, we have AI algorithms and technology that helps us reasonably predict how your book might do. And if we make you an offer, we know that your book is going to sell X amount of copies. And then they can back that up. That's going to be a pretty hard thing to compete with, right? So I do think that is a potential future of traditional publishers, should they choose to accept it, is if they can invest in AI that can help them reasonably predict the sales of a novel. Now, how can you do that? I don't know. It hasn't really been done reliably for as long as books have been around. But that doesn't mean it's not doable, and it doesn't mean that book discovery doesn't have a solution either, right? So maybe that is the solution to discoverability that we keep talking about, right? How do readers find other books that they're going to like? And how do they find books that are personalized to them, right? Well, maybe it has something to do with artificial intelligence and what people call microgranularity, right? So you can write a novel that has no mass commercial appeal, but still make a lot of good money on it if you can find an algorithm or some sort of service that can connect readers to your book, right? So I don't know. It's interesting, but I do think that it's a competition thing that writers are going to have to beware of, right? Because here's the problem with artificial intelligence, and it's a problem that I've noticed for a while. I think anyone who's in AI intrinsically knows this, right? But in learning about it, I think it's one of the things that jumps off and slaps you in the face when you're talking to people like I've been doing. I've had a few conversations with folks in the AI industry. I've been listening to podcasts. The biggest problem is the sheer amount of data that you have to have in order to be able to apply artificial intelligence to your business. Me, as a self-published writer, I don't have a whole lot of data. I'm not what you would call a data producer, right? I write a lot of books, and so I certainly have a lot of text, but even then, that's not enough text to be able to be able to have an algorithm or some sort of an AI look at it and make meaningful insights, or allow me to make meaningful insights. I just don't produce enough data to do that. I don't know that me or a group of writers, of 10 or 15 writers, would have enough data to get insights into our business, right? I mean, when you think about data, you have to have a lot of it. And when you think about AI services, I mean, they're absorbing millions and millions of characters of text, or millions and millions of data points, like an hour, and we just don't produce that level of data. I don't know for sure that publishers have a true treasure trove of data that they can give in terms of AI, but they certainly have a lot more than we do. And they certainly have the resources to do that we do. So I think that we have to be careful as writers of that, because that is a competitive advantage that publishers don't have today, but that they could have tomorrow. So again, this is just a long musing after this webinar, that I think a warning bell that you should be careful of is when publishers start truly embracing and using AI to prove a business point. So if that happens, I think pay a very close attention. Things will start to shift. And then another future that I've talked about for traditional publishers maybe is that you don't get a traditional publisher when you're alive. You get a traditional publisher when you die, so that you can keep your work in perpetuation, right? That's a whole other can of worms. So anyway, that's a webinar that I attended. I always like to pass some of that information along. Like I said, I'm not an expert in AI by any means. My knowledge of it, I would say, is still pretty basic, but I do have a commitment to learning more about it. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was, this is kind of a random thing, but it kind of has some implications for writing. So I've been listening to a lot of music lately. I have a good friend, one of my best friends. He's one of the only people that is on the same wavelength as me as music. We listen to the same kind of music. We listen to the same kind of jazz. The same kind of chords jump out at us. And so I can listen to any album, and I can reasonably predict exactly which songs that he's going to like, and vice versa. And so music is just something we enjoy doing together. We just enjoy looking at it and listening to it. And so we've been kind of sharing music back and forth. And I can't say I discovered it, because I've known about it for a few years, but been listening a lot to vaporwave. And if any of you listen to vaporwave, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on it. But essentially, it's music from the 80s and 90s that is stretched out, slowed down. There's effects added to it like reverb and distortion, and then there's usually drum beats and things like that below it. And it's kind of odd and eerie and atmospheric, but at the same time, it's very nostalgic. And if you Google it on YouTube, you'll often see videos with 90s footage, and there's like VCR. It almost looks like it's gone through a VCR 20 times. And, you'll see shopping malls, like old footage of shopping malls, and old 90s commercials, and kind of the consumerism that kind of defined the 80s and the 90s, right? And the music itself is supposed to be like this criticism, or it's a criticism / nostalgia of the 80s and 90s. And I grew up in the late 80s and 90s, and so that kind of defined my childhood. And so I don't necessarily see it as a criticism, but like some people do. But it's just very nostalgic. And I've really enjoyed listening to the music, not because it's strange, but because it's interesting to hear the different songs that artists take, right? So like there's like this really, I think it was like an obscure Diana Ross song that someone took and they slowed it down and they distorted the vocals and they put a melody on top of it, and it just blew up. It's got like 7 million views or something like that on YouTube, and a lot of people discovered Diana Ross because of that. But the problem with this genre is that it's kind of like blatant copyright infringement. Like it's some of the worst copyright infringement I've ever seen. Like artists literally just take, a song by Michael Jackson and stretch it out and sounds like a, monster. And they apply other effects to it, and that's music, right? And so it's an interesting debate, right? Is it really music, or is it just willful copyright infringement and intellectual property theft? I don't know where I fall on that. I would be curious for people who have listened to it what your thoughts are on it. I think that it's an interesting art form, and I think that it's interesting to hear people who because a lot of these vaporwave artists are people that didn't grow up in the 90s. So it's interesting to hear their take on the 90s and like what songs they sample and what songs they distort. And so that becomes this weird, I've never heard that. I grew up, I was alive in 1989, but I never heard that song, So that's interesting. And so I kind of thought, I really liked the vaporwave aesthetic. And so I've been listening to a lot of this music, and I thought, this would be a really interesting setting for a novel. Like, what if there was a vaporwave novel? And if you look at any of the vaporwave art, I mean, it's very 90s, very nostalgic. There's a lot of computer references to like Microsoft and video games, and there's a lot of like Greco-Roman statues and funky color schemes and all that. And so I thought that'd be kind of an interesting backdrop for a novel if I wanted to do that. So I've been thinking about that, and I might do that in the future. But anyway, that's just some writing thoughts that I had just based on some things that I've been listening to. So like I said, if you listen to vaporwave, I would be curious to get your thoughts on the genre, on whether it is art or whether it is complete theft. I fall somewhere in the middle, and that is someone who is very pro-copyright. So just the last thing I wanted to talk about, I'm going to be making some appearances here very soon. This week, I'm not sure when it's going to go live, but I will be doing an interview with my buddy Dale Roberts of Self-Publishing with Dale. I talk about Dale all the time on this podcast. He's a phenomenal dude. I'm going to be on his podcast, and we're going to be talking about the Alliance of Independent Authors. So I'm going to be representing Ally and talking about the different benefits that they have. So be sure to check that out. I will share that on next week's episode. But if you follow Dale on YouTube, be sure to follow him if you don't, and look for a link. And then I'm also going to be doing a podcast, not a podcast, but like a webinar with the good folks at BookBrush. So BookBrush is a service that is very much like Canva, but it's for writers, and it helps you put together really great marketing materials that are very easy to put together, and you can create like custom videos, and it's amazing. Be sure to check out the BookBrush review on my website. I will drop a link in the show notes. I did a video on this on Author Level Up, and it's done very well, and everyone who's watched it has really enjoyed it. So I'm going to be doing a joint webinar with them, and I'm going to be demoing the software and essentially showing you how to use it. It's going to be very quick and very quick and dirty. There's really no, it's not one of those webinars where you hear a pitch at the end. I mean, it's purely check it out. If you're interested in it, here's where to go find it, so on and so forth. So anyway, that's all that's going on with me this week. Hope everyone is having a phenomenal week, and I will be back with more news next week. Peace. Thanks for joining me this week. If you enjoyed this episode, you'll enjoy my backlist episodes at michaelaran.com/podcast. For your free starter library of my favorite novels, join my fan club by visiting michaelaran.com/fanclub. If you're a writer and want to connect with me further, check out my YouTube channel, Author Level Up, for helpful writing advice at authorlevelup.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week.